Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Angela Braniff. Welcome to the June Book Club, our Dangerous Women Book Club. This month I might need an inhaler or something. This month was an intense month of reading for me in terms of some of these books I read, okay? They were just intense. That's the best way I can explain it. There was good stuff too, don't get me wrong. We're not just gonna sit here and talk about sad stuff, but the books this month it was a doozy. It was a doozy. Grab a cup of coffee or tea or whatever your drink of choice is. Join me, let's chat books. For my friends who love to chat books, I love y'all so much. This is not my most viewed video. It is not something that a whole ton of people watch, but those of you who are here and enjoy books too, I love you guys. This is special to me. I don't care if there's 10 of you here watching. I love chatting about books, and I love hearing from y'all in the comments about what you read this month, what you would recommend for me to read. I had already sort of set my books that I was gonna read in June, but I've not actually set all of my books for July yet. So if you have any good suggestions for me, be sure to leave those down below in the comments. It's also super helpful for people who are looking for books to read as well, to get a bunch of suggestions down in the comments, not just from me, but from y'all too. So grab your coffee, grab your tea, grab whatever it is you need. Let's chat about some books. All right, so the first thing that I would like to point out before I get into the books that I read is there was a heavy theme this month in the books that I read of politics. Political agendas that were hidden within the book, where the book on its face seemed like it was about one thing, but definitely took a spin and a turn towards a political agenda at some point in the book, whether it was directly in sort of the beginning, middle, or end. A lot of these books had political agendas. My reading something and sharing it with you is not an indication that I agree with said author and whatever their points were. Y'all know I've said this a million times. I feel like I just need to say it again. I'm an eat the meat, spit out the bones person. I read, consume, watch things from people that I agree with and people that I don't agree with. I think that's a very important part of understanding. You really need to be able to see both sides. So I read and consume things from all types of people, whether they have the same beliefs as me or not. That might not be how you are, and that's totally fine, but that's how I am. So I just feel like I need to say that because people always like to make assumptions about what I must think or believe about some certain topic or issue based on things like, oh, well, you read such and such book, so you must agree with this. That's not how that works. All right, so y'all know I am also a mostly nonfiction reader. These are also in no particular order because I do not remember the order I read them in this month. All right, so first let's talk about Catch and Kill. I talked about it last month, and this was one that I was listening to on Audible, and I told you guys that I was gonna give up on it because I couldn't handle the voices that the author was making to impersonate sort of female voices and female voices with accents and stuff. It was driving me crazy. But many of you said to either exchange it for the hardcover book that you could return the Audible or just to push through. And I decided for ease of use, I just pushed through and did the Audible. And I actually, at some point, a lot of the back and forth of the voices really doesn't go away, but it gets to a very bare minimum and becomes much more tolerable. And I think the deeper you get into the story, the more you're able to look past that. And I have nothing against the author, but the book itself, I'm so glad that y'all recommended that I push through and that I actually did, because I really enjoyed getting to the end of this book. It was terrifying, and just the thought that these people are among us and that these people with this kind of power can do some of these truly awful things and just continue to get away with it because people are afraid and they don't think that they can speak up, and when they do, bad things can happen to them and they can lose their careers and everything. That's so dangerous. If you don't know, I'm going to read to you guys real quick. Just if you don't know, in 2017, a routine network television investigation led to a story only whispered about. One of Hollywood's most powerful producers was a predator, protected by fear, wealth, and a conspiracy of silence. As Pharaoh drew closer to the truth, shadowy operatives, from high-priced lawyers to elite war-hardened spies, mounted a secret campaign of intimidation, threatening his career, following his every move, and weaponizing an account of abuse in his own family. This is the untold story of the exotic tactics of surveillance and intimidation deployed by wealthy and connected men to threaten journalists, evade accountability, and silence victims of abuse, and the story of women who risked everything to expose the truth and spark a global movement. So it was, like I said, it was just such a good book. It was such a good book. And if you want to understand more about the Harvey Weinstein situation, it's really, really disgusting and horrible. But the book was very fascinating and interesting to see how much power, with all of this evidence and interviews, video interviews with victims who are ready to come forward, have their faces shown, names, all this, they still were getting squashed by certain media outlets because of a need to protect this person. It's disgusting, and things like this should really make me question how much we can trust our media outlets at all anymore. They seem to be very much bought and paid for by some of these very rich elites, and can we trust anything that they say if they're going to squash major stories like this just to protect personal relationships with the muckety mucks and the richy riches? So that was a very interesting book. The next book is one that I thought that I purchased it when I thought I wasn't going to finish Catch and Kill, because it's sort of about the same topic, essentially. The book is called She Said, and it's by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, and breaking the sexual harassment story that helped ignite a movement. So it's all about the Harvey Weinstein, but they go into a lot of other stories along the way. And I really liked this one because I felt like it really was very, very informative. It didn't have as much of the personal conjecture as Ronan Farrow's book did. And to be fair, he had so much personally tied up in that. But this was very interesting because this book, from the Pulitzer Prize winning reporters who broke the news of Harvey Weinstein's sexual harassment and abuse for the New York Times, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, the thrilling untold story of their investigation and its consequences for the Me Too movement. So this one, like I said, a lot of interesting other stories along the way that they shared and talked about. So I would highly recommend that one as well. Also, I felt like, they sort of posed this book as it being mostly about Harvey Weinstein, but there was also a large portion of the book that was about Christine Blasey Ford and her accusation of Brett Kavanaugh and that whole trial and process and everything. There was a lot of the book that was about that. So I was kind of surprised that they didn't, in any of the information, at least that I had read about the book prior to buying it, that it makes it seem like it's mostly about Harvey, but it's also very much about other cases too. If you're interested in all of that, I would definitely recommend those two books. To read up a little bit more on how the Me Too movement first started and what it was first about, and where its sort of origins lie and the sort of origin of its purpose and all of that. So it was very interesting. Okay, the next book. I really loved this book. It's called Mama's Last Hug by Frans de Waal. Hopefully I'm saying his name correctly. And the description is, Mama's Last Hug opens with a dramatic farewell between Mama, a dying 59-year-old chimpanzee matriarch, and biologist John von Hoof. This heartfelt final meeting of two longtime friends, widely shared as a video, offers a window into how deep and instantly recognizable these bonds can be. So begins Frans de Waal's whirlwind tour of new ideas and findings about animal emotions based on his renowned studies of the social and emotional lives of chimpanzees, bonobos, and other primates. De Waal discusses facial expressions, animal sentience and consciousness, Mama's life and death, the emotional side of human politics, and the illusion of free will. He distinguishes between emotions and feelings, all the while emphasizing the continuity between our species and other species. And he makes the radical proposal that emotions are like organs. We don't have a single organ that other animals don't have, and the same is true for our emotions. So I'm just going to go ahead and say this right now. If it wasn't obvious from the intro, he's a biologist. He believes in full evolution, no creationism whatsoever. So again, I know that I have audience on both sides. Some of y'all are somewhere in between. I just want to go ahead and say that now. So I absolutely loved this book, despite the fact that there are things said in it that go against personal things that I believe. I think it's a fantastic book. Again, I'm able to separate what I believe about certain things from maybe what an author writes about what they believe about certain things. But no matter where you fall on the evolution creation spectrum, I think that this book was so incredible, learning about the differences between emotions and feelings. I thought that was really fascinating. It's something that, again, we don't tend to pick apart, but once you start to, you're like, oh, wait a second. And then learning about different animals and their facial expressions. And again, he does talk about other animals besides, chimpanzees and stuff, but very briefly. And just learning about Mama and her story and how her 59 years of life, what they learned from her and what they learned about the social lives of animals like chimpanzees who live in community similar to us. And so many parallels there, so many things that are very interesting to understand how the hierarchies work. There's a wonderful story in there about an adoption that takes place with a chimpanzee that cannot make enough milk and her babies keep dying, and she's just heartbroken and she's devastated. And I had tears in my eyes during this part of the story where you're hearing about this chimpanzee that's just devastated that she keeps losing babies, and they have another chimpanzee who's unable to care for her babies due to her being deaf. And because she's deaf, she can't hear their cries when they need to eat. She can't hear their cries if she actually sits on them. And so she has inadvertently killed some of her own babies. So anyways, it's just incredible. They teach her they teach the one chimpanzee how to bottle feed. They give her a doll and a bottle, and she learns to bottle feed. And then this other chimpanzee, they basically adopt the baby of the one to this one, and she bottle feeds. And even at one point, they remark on how she picks up the baby and burps it without, no one ever showed her that. No one told her to burp the baby, but she does it. It's just like, oh, it gives me chills. And it was just, there's so many little anecdotal things along the way that were such incredible stories. And I just really enjoyed this book, learning so much about animals and behavior. And he has another book that I'm currently reading right now, so I'll talk about it next month. But it's about, are we smart enough to know how smart animals are? I just thought this book was fantastic, learning about, again, the difference between emotions and feelings and how they work together and separately. So I absolutely loved this book, and I would highly recommend it if you are interested in animals and animal emotions and things like that. I think you would really enjoy this book. Let's just keep going with that theme. The next book is The Body Keeps the Score. This is by Bessel van der Kolk, who is a doctor, and I'll just read you quickly. A pioneering researcher and one of the world's foremost experts on traumatic stress, offers a bold new paradigm for healing trauma is a fact of life. Veterans and their families deal with the painful aftermath of combat. 1 in 5 Americans has been molested. 1 in 4 grew up with alcoholics. 1 in 3 couples have engaged in physical violence. Such experiences inevitably leave traces on minds, emotions, and even on biology. Sadly, trauma sufferers frequently pass on their stress to their partners and children. Renowned trauma expert Bessel van der Kolk has spent over 3 decades working with survivors. In The Body Keeps the Score, he transforms our understanding of traumatic stress, revealing how it literally rearranges the brain's wiring, specifically areas dedicated to pleasure, engagement, control, and trust. He shows how these areas can be reactivated through innovative treatments, including neurofeedback, mindfulness techniques, play, yoga, and other therapies. Based on his own research and that of other leading specialists, The Body Keeps the Score offers proven alternatives to drugs and talk therapy and a way to reclaim lives. I would highly recommend this book to anyone who's planning on being a foster parent or adopting a child. 100% yes. I would also recommend this book for any parent at all, because I think that there's certain chapters where he talks about attachment and why the attachment with children matters, where it comes from, what their brains are telling them, and it's fascinating to understand. Now, he talks a lot about in the beginning, it kind of talks first about post-traumatic stress in terms of veterans. And that was like eye-opening and heartbreaking. I thought that I knew a fair amount about that topic. And there was a lot of things that I was unaware of. A lot of the PTSD is not because of things that the soldiers themselves, for example, when he works with these former soldiers from Vietnam, it's not because of things that they saw necessarily, but things that they did themselves, things that they had to do on the battlefield, if you will. And it is heartbreaking. Yeah, so this is a book that is not, there's a lot of it that's like not for the faint of heart. A lot of the stories he tells just will rip you apart. But I do think that it's one of those things that, again, it's the kind of pain that we just need to sit in and recognize is happening all around us. And when he's talking about statistics and he's talking about how 1 in 5 Americans have been molested and 1 in 3 American couples has had some kind of physical violence altercation. That's just crazy to me. That's hard to think about. It's hard to imagine. And when you understand the implications of these things, what they can cause, the damage that they can cause, and we look around us, it just all of the hurt and brokenness in the world, and all of the wrong ways that people attempt to go about healing their own pain and trauma, and all of the things they use in an effort to self-diagnose, self-heal. And he talks a lot about the misdiagnosis and how many people are diagnosed with other things when it's actually a trauma issue, but it's manifesting itself in their life, in their body, in their minds, in other ways. And that part is ignored. No one's ever talking about that. And so they're getting medicated for this, which is not fixing, it's not a solution. They need to go through the steps of healing over here. And it's not just a book where he presents all this and is like, it's a problem. I mean, he offers solutions, and he's been doing this for decades. And I found his work fascinating. I found the book fascinating. And like I said, I think it's a must read for adoptive parents, foster parents, any parent, and any person. It's one of those books that I just think that any person could benefit from. There's stuff to take away for anyone. But if you are definitely a parent, but even more specifically a foster or adoptive parent, I cannot recommend this book enough to try to help understand a little bit better what's happening and maybe in the minds of the children that are in your home that have come from traumatic backgrounds, and why some of the things that some of the behaviors that present, some of the emotions that present, some of the disorders and stuff are actually just trauma reactions and responses. And again, offering the techniques and the ideas and the places that you can go and the ways that you can help your child find healing. I just found this book to be absolutely incredible, and definitely one I would recommend. All right, the next book is a memoir. This one was In the Shadow of the Valley by Bobby Kahn. Let me just read you the details. Bobby Kahn was raised in a remote Kentucky holler in 1980s Appalachia. She remembers her tin-roofed house tucked away in a vast forest paradise, the sparkling creeks with their frogs and crawdads, the sweet blackberries growing along the road to her granny's, and her abusive father, an underemployed alcoholic whose untethered rage and violence against Bobby and her mother were frighteningly typical of a community marginalized, desperate, and ignored. Bobby's rule of survival? Always be vigilant, but endure it silently. Slipping away from home, Bobby went to college and got a white-collar job, mistrusted by her family for her progress, and condescended to by peers for her accent and her history. She was followed by the markers of her class. Though she carried her childhood self everywhere, Bobby also finally found her voice. So if you remember last month, I read Hillbilly Elegy from J.D. Vance, and so this book was recommended to me from Amazon, I think, probably because I had bought that other book. And so I decided to read this one as well, and I thought this one was so good. It was arguably a lot more intense than J.D. Vance's book. Her experiences and her endurance of abuse, J.D. Vance his book didn't quite have that. That's not his story, right? Like it is hers. And hers was, gosh, there was a lot of very disturbing stuff in it in terms of the abuse that she endured, her mother, her brother, and even their pets. And I use that term pets loosely for the family situation. But again, this is an area of our country that I feel, and the class of people that Bobby comes from, is largely forgotten when we think of the poor and the marginalized in our country. And so it was just a very heartbreaking and fascinating look at that life and growing up there and learning how not uncommon her own story and situation was. But I do really appreciate that it's not this, here's how difficult my childhood was, I went away to college and overcame it all and everything is fantastic. She really owns, I felt like, after leaving her family's home and going out on her own, that her life still was derailed and she still made a lot of really poor decisions and a lot of really bad things happened to her, and bad decisions were made post getting out of the abusive home. So that wasn't a cure-all, right? Getting out of that abusive home. And she shares things that to me were very honest and real and raw, and things that didn't make her look good, but were the truth. The next book is just a really short, quick read. It's actually not a full book, but I thought it was worth mentioning because I found it very, very fascinating. It's called We Are One, The Story of Bayard Rustin. It's written by Larry Dane Brimner. And the description is, or the summary is, you may have never heard of him, but you've probably heard of the many people civil rights activist Bayard Rustin influenced. He was a mentor to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and refused to move to the back of the bus many years before Rosa Parks did. The son of a freed slave, Bayard Rustin grew up during the peak of the Jim Crow laws, which segregated blacks and whites. His own family was fairly well off and hosted distinguished guests like Mary McLeod Bethune, and Bayard could not stand to hear the stories of blacks elsewhere who were treated with disrespect because of the color of their skin. He made it his life's mission to change these ideas, and as a young man, he began traveling the United States as an activist. Larry Dane Brimner, a prolific and award-winning author of nonfiction for children, illuminates the story of this little-known but influential civil rights leader. So I was very interested in reading this book because I had not heard, in everything I had read and learned about Martin Luther King Jr., I had not read that he was that this was his mentor. And so I wanted to read more and learn more about this man. I found this book both enlightening but also very heartbreaking. His family's story and some of the things that he himself endured, but he was very much a pacifist. He was a follower of Gandhi at the time. He did actually even go to India at one point as well. Gandhi had already passed away, but he was really a very believed in peacefulness, and listening to his story and things that he endured in the name of that was really profound, I think. And one of the things at the end of the book that I feel like they just kind of slip it in at the end, and I was like, oh man, that really just kind of stopped me in my tracks. How he sort of parted ways with Martin Luther King Jr., but it was really surprising and shocking to me, and it seemed to come out of nowhere. So I would highly recommend, I don't want to give it away, so you'll want to read the book, but it was one of those things that just made me feel sad, and it was just very surprising and also just very sad to me how all of that ended, if you will. So again, it's a very quick read. It's a short book, particularly if you're interested in learning more about the roots of the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King Jr. and all of that. So highly recommend that book. I'll leave it linked down below with everything else. And the last book, this one was recommended to me based on reading Atomic Habits. And this book is called Fortitude, American Resilience in the Era of Outrage by Dan Crenshaw. And it says basically in 2012, on his third tour of duty, an improvised explosive device left Dan Crenshaw's right eye destroyed and his left blinded. Only through the careful hand of his surgeons and what doctors called a miracle did Crenshaw's left eye recover partial vision. And yet he persevered, completing 2 more deployments. Why? There are certain stories we tell ourselves about the hardships we face. We can become paralyzed by adversity, or we can adapt and overcome. We can be fragile, or we can find our fortitude. Crenshaw delivers a set of lessons to help you do just that. So this book was interesting. There was a lot I agreed with. There was some stuff I didn't agree with. But the overall message, again, like I said, I'm an eat the meat, spit out the bones kind of person. I think that the idea of picking yourself up by the bootstraps and carrying on is, I'm all for that. I also believe that there's some circumstances and situations where that's not possible. And so I don't like the notion that that's the way forward for every single person, because it's not. There will always be people in situations that doesn't apply for. But for a lot of us, it absolutely does and is a great way of looking at life. And he tells a lot of really interesting stories about his own childhood and life and his time as a soldier. And he has failures in this book where it's not something that, oh, he just has the fortitude and he overcomes it. There's failures in this book that don't get overcome. I liked that he included that in the story as well. Everything didn't always work out rosy for him. But one of the biggest things that I appreciated about the way that he shares his story and stuff is, if y'all recall, when he was on SNL or whatever the situation was, where the comedian made fun of him, said something about him, and he got wind of it, and people expected him to be outraged. They expected him to freak out and insist on this guy being canceled, right? Like, how dare you insult a combat veteran who's missing an eye, right? Like, is Pete. I read this book like at the very beginning of the month, so I don't remember all the names. And Dan's thing was like, I mean, it was comedy, it was fun, like just the way that he handled it and responded to it, I really appreciated. And as he talked through his thoughts on how to respond to it, how to deal with it, I just really enjoyed that, particularly being on this platform and seeing how on platforms like this and on social media and stuff, it takes one thing for people to just done, right? And it can be something very small. Of course, there's big things that people do. Don't get me wrong. Big things that people do that absolutely should be done. But there's also little things that happen here and there that it's like, we've lost a lot of our ability to laugh at things. We've lost a lot of like what's funny, what's not, what's allowed to be funny, what's not. And so it's a really strange thing to navigate sometimes. And I just appreciated that, instead of where he would have had, in terms of how this current culture works, he would have had carte blanche to be like demanding this guy be fired. And he didn't do that. And I found that to be a respectable thing. Like, it's okay. I don't know. I just appreciated that people make mistakes, and this rush for outrage doesn't have to be, we don't have to end there every single time, right? Like, every little tiny thing that happens doesn't need to result in this giant, huge outrage where people lose their livelihoods and their entire careers over something that they could very potentially learn from and change and become better for. And I think he talks about that a little bit, and it's something that I think, just sharing a little bit of my own thoughts on it, is that one of the biggest things I see that scares me is losing the ability to overcome and to make mistakes and to learn from them and to grow. With the way that a lot of things get handled these days, I feel that we're losing that. And it's a very important, critical part of being a human being, is making a mistake and having, whether it be your small family community scold you, learn from it, and move on, or the larger community, or even farther beyond. But our ability to learn from something and make a change, and then change the trajectory of our life, right? To make a mistake, learn from it, and move on. We're losing that. Our mistakes are costing us everything these days. And for some mistakes, they should, but not for all. And so I just, that part of the message really resonated with me in terms of the cost analysis of some mistakes that people make shouldn't cost them everything, you know? This was kind of a memoir wrapped with a self-helpy kind of message in it. Very much the pick yourself up by the bootstraps and the fortitude and all of that, which there's so much of it that I agree with, but also some of it that I don't. So it's kind of, again, one of those books for me, and eat the meat, spit out the bones kind of thing. But that's it. That brings us to the end of my books for June. Like I said, leave me down below in the description box any suggestions you have for me for July. I'm already starting on my books for July, but I don't have my list compiled yet of everything. So I would love some suggestions from y'all. I'm going to comb back through last month's suggestions as well and grab some from there too. So thank you guys for joining me for another installment of our Dangerous Women Book Club. Eventually I'll make us t-shirts and mugs This is a really cute The Best Is Yet to Come mug. I'll leave this link down below. It's from a Etsy shop, and I also have a really cute shirt from her too. But I want to make us some like t-shirts and mugs. I don't want to give it away yet, but I want to make our little book club some t-shirts and mugs, and eventually we'll actually have a group where we can talk about books. I'm getting there. One thing at a time, one thing at a time. That's it for today's video though, y'all, and I will see you guys again very soon. Bye.